things that we consider our priorities, and they match very well with statements that the preceding speakers covered. So thanks, Geraldine.
Okay, so how do NGOs interact with farmers and catchment groups? As NGIs, that is non-government individuals, we mostly work with NGOs and specialise in waterway and wetland condition assessments for project management purposes. We require local project coordinators to do the preliminary liaison work with landholders, as Tegan experienced when she first arrived. This is a best practice since it is more beneficial for them to build the connections than for us as external consultants who turn up, do our thing and then go away. Landholder interest in what we do can be quite varied. Some are interested and we take time to inform them about what we are doing and to hear their side of things. Some are very wary of having anyone come onto their property and fail to see the purpose of our investigations. But most are busy elsewhere during our field work. One thing we have noticed is that what's living in waterways draws the interest of young and old alike, much more than measuring the pH of water. Half-day environmental interest events have been popular and well attended by a variety of people from local community, but male adults are the least represented. And so I'm uncertain how these awareness-raising events can help shift people's perspectives. So where do NGOs get their resources, Steve?
Yes, well, quite a bit's been said on that, but I do want to point out that natural resource management officers are critical for promoting a wider ecological understanding of the landscape in the community, and that perhaps contributes to Murray's question was there. And however, they are hampered, as we've heard, by having to compete, I consider often waste a lot of effort, for limited funds from various agencies. As a result, NRM, in our experience, suffers from a lack of career status, with unstable employment positions overseeing an unpredictable parade of activities. So beside government grants, vital resources that are easily overlooked and marginalised are volunteer effort, I think many of you appreciate that, landholder facilitation of project activity, pro bono contributions by environmental specialists and by NRMOs themselves. So what are the key lessons that we've come across from river and wetland management? Geraldine.
Okay. So the strongly independent outlook of farmers is an essential trait in our agricultural free enterprise economy, but it is also a barrier to achieving an accepted strategic approach to NRM at the catchment and sub-catchment scale. Although an encouraging number of landholders do value their streams and wetlands, informed action to improve their ecological condition is not well advanced in terms of methodology. Various landholders do undertake rehabilitation works on their own initiative, but countering this is the neglect and ad hoc works which certainly do not improve the quality of waterways and wetlands. Therefore, a crucial goal among community awareness raising is a cultural shift in how landholders go about custodianship of their non-productive natural parts of the landscape. Broad community indifference regarding the state of our waterways is the major obstacle to achieving better management of riparian ecosystems. So what more needs to be done to improve outcomes? Steve?
Yeah, thanks. Lots been mentioned of finding synergies between our conserving natural values and the productivity issue, which is essential. So finding those synergies between the demands of farming enterprise, and I would add in here rural lifestyle and conserving ecological values, is going to be a critical element for achieving optimum ecological outcomes. We have to really do a lot of thinking about this. But I think wanted to add in that idea of rural lifestyle. It's not just all about money and bank balances, for sure. For example, and this is one that's been brought up, carbon farming. So can carbon farming improve the condition of catchment waterways and wetlands? So we need to be doing a lot of thinking about that. Now, strategic plans, that's something we've been involved with for decades. Now, in the past, these have been often created for catchment communities by external consultants and specialists, and I've been involved in doing that myself, who are constrained by short project timeframes and loose landholder consultation. As a result, community ownership of the plan is weak, has been weak, or even non-existent eventually. There are those reports sitting with cobwebs on various shelves. Some of them ours, I think. The creation of formal catchment groups, which has been an approach to take, I don't think is as important as locals simply working together to develop their own long-term plans in a format which makes sense to them. Now, conversely, funders impose one-size-fits-all requirements for prioritising project applications in an excessively competitive funding environment. However, community developed strategic plans would mean funding committees needed to do more homework to evaluate and endorse diverse proposals. So I think there's a bit of a schism there. People want a plan that they can identify with, but you're having to put in a plan that satisfies external funders. I think it's an important point. So it's important for government agencies, NRM groups, small, medium and large, and individual practitioners to challenge their own operational paradigms at this stage if we want to move things ahead. We've got to challenge things we've accepted as, well, this is the way it's been, or this is how we should be thinking. It's going to require quite a bit of creative thought. The challenge then will be to find ways to develop a culture. Bruce mentioned about change. It's not about changing necessarily individuals, trying to control them, but we can work to change culture. And culture then, people will follow on and with what the way the culture's going. You've all got mobile phones, haven't you? You're victims of cultural change. So, and wetland management at the catchment scale becomes an accepted part of farming enterprise. An agreed, robust, strategic approach must rest on that cultural foundation.
Waterway condition monitoring. So this is something that we have done a fair amount of. The common lament amongst ourselves, and we've heard amongst researchers already today too, is the lack of sufficient before data to confidently describe environmental trends. The deficit is also an archival issue, and we just heard a little bit of that from our Landcare heroes who's been here before us. Where does data go once it is collected? How does it fit into waterway management? And how accessible will it be for the local natural resource managers? IT has advanced greatly, and it helps with the means of handling environmental data, but that does not guarantee data is well managed, or that practitioners can extract useful information from it. Waterway condition monitoring is an essential management tool. Monitoring has remained an erratic occupation due to its attachment to boom and bust project activity.
And I might say here, we're talking in terms of monitoring, I'm talking about fairly local catchment and waterways monitoring, not satellite view and satellite level information. It's sort of, see, one thing you can't see from a satellite is the lizard under a log. And so there's that important of on-ground information that, so I'm just qualifying in terms of monitoring is the condition. What's the condition of this reach? What's the condition of that river pool? That sort of level of information, which is important for being able to audit how things are progressing. So a catchment scale or sub-catchment scale monitoring framework for NGOs and NRMOs use is desirable, but should not be complex, so complex that it requires continual engagement of specialists and researchers. Doesn't exclude it, but if it's completely dependent on a university or some research agency, we're going to run into logistical problems. So the level of monitoring would serve management purposes. I think of three, namely understanding the current situation. Community people, landowners understand what's happening in their catchment waterways. Steering on-ground actions and tracking progress towards desired environmental outcomes. So environmental monitoring at that scale will be most effective if these aims work in concert. So just to finish off, remote sensing technology and GIS capability. I'm a bit of a technophile, I love that sort of stuff. Capability is important and it aids ground-based data collection. So I think that's what offers a foundation for consistent monitoring of waterway conditions. You can take that information and then put local parochial information onto that if we can do that. Therefore, an important aim in the development is the development of project coordinator skills, whether they want to learn GIS or not, I think they should, and ensure ready access to emerging technologies. So that's basically, and we'll leave it there and pass it over to Basil or Sylvia. Basil.
I'm going to complement this with an approach directly to a funding proposal. But first to say, it's based on the Cranbrook Lakes conservation case study of the past 10 or 15 years of us Greenskills working with Gillamai and a whole range of other groups. And you can see up there acknowledging some of our partners. So what is the proposal? So it's a wetland biodiversity conservation services model, which includes fencing and start off with a 3-year pilot program, strategic revegetation, foreshore rehabilitation, strategic weed and feral predator control, and associated wetland bioindicators, fauna, linked to citizen science. So certainly building on some of Viv's ideas. Now, we heard from John about a whole range of funding proposals, but certainly the existing state and federal funding models that we have, state NRM, are not adequate for this. We've had piecemeal funding for the Cranbrook study, the Cranbrook work over the last few years, and it's so short-term and so difficult to get and so competitive that what we need is a committed one very much on a program of wetland biodiversity or biodiversity ecosystem services model. And I would really ask for our advocates for funding for this region, that's our NRM bodies, but also WA Landcare Network. We need a new government program, probably at the state level, which will fund that type of a new approach to funding ongoing where farmers working with NGOs and our own groups are paid for delivering wetland protection services. Absolutely essential. And when you look at the advocates, for example, for road funding, for health funding, for education funding, where we need much better advocates for funding in the biodiversity field. So the Cranbrook Lakes, nature reserves and lots of privately held lake systems. And that's the project area from the last 15 years. It's certainly part of the Sandplain we've been talking about, and we've learned so much more about the hydrology and the surface water. There's been wetland suite management. This was partnerships through the Department of then Warden Rivers Commission. So that was the Ballacup wetland suites, that provided the overview, but again, many years ago. And the key thing is the unprotected foreshores and the degradation of all those lake systems over many years. So I think all of us were aware of that, and it's how do we address that on such a large scale. So the key, a crucial part, particularly for where there's still a lot of livestock, and that's both for sheep in the North Stirlings and cattle and so on, where we were on Monday, is fencing off the foreshores. And so we have enough now evidence that fencing of these lake systems is absolutely crucial where there's still sheep and stock-based enterprises. Bella Vista's a 5,000 hectare farm. We've had 2 years of funding, which has fenced off 20 kilometres around 16 lakes and made a huge difference. So that's tapping into NRM funding, but we need that on a considerably larger scale over the whole Sandplain. However, the work of Gillamai and NRM groups and NGOs over the last, since 2010, has made a huge difference. So if you look at the map, that's the Stirling Ranges, and in red are those areas that have been protected by landcare fencing, and it's made a landscape scale difference. That represents about 6 broadacre farms, so that's the scale of work there, but it's over a period of time, it can make a huge difference towards protecting those Salt Lake foreshores. I'm a great advocate of whole of property rapid assessment biodiversity, so a team of people going out just for a day to look at all the remnants and lakes and provide a vision of the scale of fencing and re-veg needed and rehabilitation, but also to be able to prioritize them. So we need far more of these whole of property assessments where landholders can be given the reports and which also provide the project-ready proposals for the type of ecosystem services or even NRM projects that are required. So again, let's look at a Bella Vista in more detail. How those lakes were ever released, of course, is a failure of planning in the beginning, but thanks to farmers like Wayne Peck, who's a real leader in going towards zero carbon farming, he's assisted with now, firstly, the mapping and prioritizing all those fencing and bushland areas, with most of those lake systems now fenced off. There's been, of course, fencing off is just the beginning of proper management. So the types of rehabilitation include forced brushing with paper bark and other locally acquired. So it's trying to develop low-cost methods of brushing kilometres of Salt Lake foreshore. And this is tapping into the Nulak Ranger team from Badgerbup. Of course, there are hundreds of salt lakes across the Great Southern and Wheat Belt, and this type of work actually fits very well with a ranger program. It's just we need the funding model that will see this type of work continue. So wherever the lakes are fenced, you've got the opportunity for this type of rehabilitation, but also tapping into carbon and biodiversity direct seeding. So this is Greening Australia with their various programs, and on this 15 hectares of direct seeding foreshore just a month ago. And again, that's trying to tap into the carbon support, but it's complex because these are not, it's that whole thing of firstly insisting it be biodiverse and local provenance, and secondly, that it's strategic. It's focusing on these the areas that are not most crucial for productive farming. Alongside this program has been lots of community education. So on the Lehman farm was Bob's Lake Bird Hide, which has proved to be a real asset in terms of showcasing lakes and bird life, shorebird conservation, the school linkages with the Cranbrook School and the Tambalup School and the Franklin schools, essential. You know, you're reaching parents through their primary age school children, producing things like YouTube clips. This was one that where we filmed some of the school outings, but also the biodiversity monitoring, and each of the students at the Cranbrook Primary School got a pen drive to take this video home to their families. And of course, it's trying to find flagship species which can market the message of why protecting our wetlands is so important. So we've got our hooded plovers recently increased in their status. We heard earlier from Viv the wonderful work of Steve Elson from Ongerup, and this is a classic case of when you can match data with the needs for wetland fencing and prioritization. So it's all of, quite a few years of Steve Elson's monitoring of where hooded plover nesting sites are across some of the Cranbrook Lake system, and that type of information and data is absolute gold in terms of prioritizing where limited fencing funds can go. So a real plus for that type of matching of bird data with with actual on-ground support and funding. So I thought I'd show some of our resident shorebirds, which is things that really motivates us to keep involved, in our migratory shorebirds. Part of the problem of federal funding is, all of these are protected by international treaties, and yet the funding for EBC species is so limited. It's very hard to argue. We should be able to argue that protecting our lakes, salt lake systems, is honouring these critically endangered species, but we haven't yet been able to tap into regional partnerships funding for this sort of work. So coming back to the proposal, I'm putting the call out for our NRM groups, but also the advocacy groups, to really advocate for a demonstration, maybe call it a pilot program, but we do need a biodiversity eco-services model for delivering ongoing, scaled-up funding in our region. And we heard that it's 900,000 hectares of sandplain between here and Bremer Bay and inland to Tambalap. If we're going to be protecting those wetlands and swamps on private land, we need a different type of funding model, and we need to insist that the state government, with its big surpluses at the moment, put a small amount of that towards developing these type of pilot programs. So coming back to just acknowledging all our wonderful partner groups, and of course the landholders who make everything permissible. So I'll leave it at that.
My partner Peter and I live on a farm 100 kilometres northeast of here, near the town of Wellstead. Don suggested I might like to contribute a segment on some of the land use changes in the Wellstead Sandplain wetlands area, so I'm going to try and do this really speedily. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Menang people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Of course, they have lived on the Wellstead Sandplain areas for over 40,000 years. Thank you for all the generously shared knowledge and stories about their connection to country and its spiritual significance to their ongoing culture. Peter and I very much believe in the philosophy which our Menang elders have taught us, that we are only custodians of the land for a short while. We will come and go, but the land will always be there and should be managed so it retains its good health for future generations to be able to live there safely with enough food, fresh water, and a climate that isn't too inhospitable. I would like to declare that I view the landscape with ecologist eyes, not agricultural eyes. I don't speak about the land like a typical farmer, talking about yields and chasing maximum productivity from the land. It's not that I criticise farmers and the way they speak, it's just the way I grew up, and that's the perspective I come from. During my career, I had the privilege to work as a Land for Wildlife Officer for the Department of Conservation and Land Management. It's not called that anymore, DBCA, in the South Coast region of WA for 17 years. I visited over 200 farming properties across the region. Each property had a bushland area that the owners had chosen to protect and undertake long-term management to maintain the integrity of its biodiversity. They were practicing land sharing, integrating wildlife conservation into their farming systems. I got to see many, many different landscapes, many different vegetation communities, and many different farming operations. My parents arrived on the Wellstead Sandplains in 1965 when I was a 6-month-old baby. The land on which the farm was located was part of the WA state government land release of bushland for agricultural development in the southwest of WA. These properties were released as conditional purchase, and the new land settlers, or as Keith Bradbury from Gondwana Link says, new land settlers on ancient landscapes. They were obliged to clear a 10% area of their bushland each year with an aim to clearing the whole property. If you failed to keep up with this quota, the land could be taken away from you by the government. It's hard to get information on the land releases in WA, but from the scattered bits of information, it looks like from 1947 through to the mid-1980s, there was almost 1 million acres of land released into agriculture per year in this southwest region. The clearing included everything: wetlands, rivers, sandy dune areas, forested areas, hilltops, rocky outcrop areas, etc. We are all very aware of the consequences of the overclearing, which has resulted in rising water tables, increased salinity, topsoil erosion, and contributed to native species decline. When I was over in the National Library last year, I managed to get my hands on a set of photos of where the farm is actually located, but the photos were from pre-clearing. And this particular aerial photo mosaic was compiled in about 1956. This is Mettlers Lake Road, if any of you are familiar with it, and here it is this year. And this is Mettlers Lake, and I think this wetland out here, or sorry, that one, matches this one here. It was particular interest because that track there is actually our front driveway. And if you look down here, it's in this position right here. It goes around a Yate swamp. And there are all the little wetland areas dotted across the landscape. Those linear dunes are running through the landscape here, and on our property there's actually one that just sits, come down here, there it is running straight through the landscape. For me, it was really exciting to find a pre-clearing photo. I actually cried in the library because I think we all feel that heartache. We all drive through this landscape and often imagine, what was it like? What was it like when the bush used to be here? And try to imagine it. And I've got something I can actually home in on and have a good look. By 1980, my family finally stopped clearing the bush. The property was run as a sheep grazing property for wool and meat. There was about 12% or 150 hectares remaining remnant vegetation. I did a rough survey trying to determine the number of native plants that were probably killed during the land clearing process on the farm. And at a very conservative estimate, it was about 55 million. That's one title in this South Coast region. The number of native fauna killed during this process is beyond our imagination. They couldn't move to the small amounts of remaining vegetation left in the district because, of course, that was already occupied. Of course, with soil erosion, dust storms, and even the emergence of little bits of salt in the northern parts of the Wellstead district, the emergence of the landcare movement in the 1990s was enthusiastically embraced. I remember going to landcare meetings in the Wellstead District Hall in the early 1990s, and nearly the whole community was present. They formed a landcare district committee, the Ag Department assisted with guidance, the meetings would sometimes drag on till 11 or 12 o'clock at night because the people just wouldn't stop talking. The DPIRD team was very involved with helping many of the Wellstead farmers design their landcare farm maps for each of their individual properties, and this incorporated protection of their waterways, fencing off their remnant bushland, protecting their soils. For about a decade, Wellstead District hosted landcare officers. We had 4, I think, who resided within the district and helped direct funding into on-ground landcare projects under the umbrella of DPIRD. Alongside landcare, the Wellstead Naturalist Group published this amazing set of books. I take my hat off to my mother and her colleagues who published first a book on the birds of Wellstead, then a book on the Banksias of Wellstead, then the Eucalypts of Wellstead, and then they attempted the wattles of Wellstead, and that one killed them. And they almost stopped there, but they went on to the geology of the Wellstead district as well. So somewhere in these early settlers, there was this growing interest and attachment and love of the landscape that they had come in with very little advice and just cleared. And they were hurting, I think, about the damage that they had caused. We were all taught about the 3 pillars of landcare, and if you kept these in balance, it would help to keep our environment and rural communities strong, healthy, and economically robust. I heard a lot about the wetland and hydrology projects being installed during the 1990s and early 2000s by Don's mob. Deep Earth were doing so much exciting research and were teaching the Wellstead community members so much about the surface water, the underground hydrology, the internal drainage of the amazing wetland areas, and about the catchment basins. Funding was available for fencing off the remnant veg. Re-veg was installed to stabilise eroded junior areas. Y banks and W banks were installed. Over 100, I'll say piezometers, but I think they're actually called measuring wells, were installed across the district so landholders could monitor the water table. And then we had a land use change. In the early 1990s, just as the land care ethos was spreading across the community, the blue gum industry arrived as well. My parents were getting on in age, with my father actually hitting his 70s, and he was feeling tired. His 5 children, which included me, we'd all run off, and he was looking to reduce his workload. So he could either sell or maybe lease the land to blue gum plantations, and it looked like a good option. And when he was listening to Landcare and the Ag Department, we had a rising water table. Maybe this very tall perennial crop could actually help with the water table. He staggered the planting, installing about 140 hectares every second year over a 10-year period. So the property ended up with about 840 hectares of blue gums, which encompassed over 1 million trees. During the 1990s, most of the cleared part of the farm was put into blue gums. And yeah, as I said, they're a 20-metre tall crop and they're a huge transpiration machine. So when Peter and I took back the management of the farm in 2014, because my father had reached his 80s and he decided to leave, some of those blue gums were reaching their 10th year or their 20th year, and that was the time for harvesting. I don't know if any of you have lived next to harvesting, which goes on for 2 or 3 months. It's pretty noisy and it's dramatically, visually high impact. And so when the company leaves, they leave you with a landscape that looks like that. It's quite tough to pull that back into some form of agricultural land use. So Peter and I decided we would completely redesign and try and do something to stop the farm deteriorating in health. We have been trying to strike a balance between healthy food production and restoring the rich ecological values of the landscape. We wanted it to be a model of regenerative farming with alive, healthy soils as a core farm philosophy. William Pools has a permanent freshwater creek and 150 hectares of biodiverse remnant bushland. These 2 land features are recognised as the jewels of the property. We have revegetated 100 hectares of provenance wildlife corridors, and we networked that across the property, reconnecting all remnant vegetation with larger bits of bush in all reserve areas. We have also buffer planted all the smaller bits of bushland, trying to reduce the impact of edge effects. The major commercial component of the property is small paddocks with rotational grazing, and we have a flock of about 2,500 happy sheep. And we measured the piezometers. What had the blue gums done with that water table? Well, they had actually either just held it or they'd just taken it down slightly over that 20-year time period. And I'll talk about it a bit later, but okay. So that was a good thing. And somebody was talking about lifestyle in farming, things that bring you happiness or just fun. So we have a sideline of producing a bit of honey, and we do go out and do a lot of seed collecting. It's fun, and sometimes we sell a bit of that seed. It's not the main goal with that, and we use it for a lot of our own re-veg. When we sell products like the honey, we're actually marketing the name of the farm and again promoting that regenerative ethos. And by the way, that honey has a total antimicrobial activity which falls into the top 0.6% levels of honeys with such high TAAs around Australia. I think that connects back to the very high biodiversity of the vegetation in that area and a strong jarrah base. So the wildlife-friendly agroecology management style of William Poole's farm falls under that land-sharing umbrella. The property is set up and has the potential to join emerging markets with increased transparency from paddock to plate, chasing cleaner, greener, ethical food products. Now, I'm aware of the time, so you just say, Sylvia, that's it, get off. Okay, so last year, Peter and I were awarded the 2021 WA Landcare Farming Award. We were very, very surprised and felt very privileged to have this recognition. Interestingly, when we told our adult kids about winning the Landcare Farmers Award, one of them said, "Gee, Mum, if you guys won the WA Farmers Landcare Award, then landcare in WA must be really bad." These millennium young people, they're so rude. But anyway, but when Peter and I thought about it, he had a really good point because he was raised during the 1990s. He's a landcare kid. He did lots of seed collecting, planted lots of seedlings. We talked about landcare and health all the time. And he thought that most of the farmers out there across the region were carrying on with those works. So we're surprised that we won the award too because we thought we weren't doing anything particularly special and we were just following on with all those landcare plans and ideas that were put forward in the 1990s. But it was then very surprising to get the national award. So Peter and I will just have to rise to the occasion and speak out. So we're back on the farm, and about 3 years ago, another land use change started happening around us. So we had corporate ownership on 3 sides and 1 private property. That private property, absolute replica of our property with blue gums all over it, got sold into cropping. And on the other 3 sides, leased to cereal cropping. We had never had cereal cropping this far south in the landscape, and Peter and I feel like we were very naive and we weren't looking northward and looking at that southward movement of croppers coming down our way. So they speak a very different language to us and have a very different land use to us. Yes, okay, let's just go on. Slide 19. So everybody reads the headlines every year of record crop harvest volumes around Australia. It continues to become an increasingly popular agricultural product, and broadacre farmers are pushing cropping into areas of southwestern WA where it has never existed before. Unfortunately, most of the cereal croppers in WA use the soils basically as a hydroponic medium to apply a program of synthetic chemicals and fertilisers to chase the golden dream of increased annual yield. The price for this is the health of the natural ecology systems in our landscapes. In the last 7 years, Peter and I have witnessed the clearing of inconvenient bushland, the taking out of all the single paddock trees, incursions of crops closer and closer to riparian zones, the clearing of landcare plantings done over 20 years ago, and cropping into areas that had been protected in the past due to fragile soils. When I grew up on the farm, we had families on each of the neighbouring farms around us. Now there are no neighbours living next door in any direction. The population of the district has dropped to about 1/5 of what it was 50 years ago. Many of the district landholders own 2, 3, 4 or 5 farms, managing up to about 8,000 hectares. Peter and I can hardly manage the 1,200 hectare single property that we are on. We don't get enough time to visit each special bit of the bush on the farm each year. So there is no way that these larger farmers get any time to connect to some of the special natural places on their larger land holdings. What has been lost? That lovely, intimate, detailed knowledge that farmers used to have about their landscape. The special things that they were the only ones that saw them. As one of the local Noongar elders, Lynette Knapp, said, "There will be no one left to sing the land, and the land will get lonely." The land is viewed, or seems to be viewed, purely as an industrial production space. The disconnect to land, soil and country just keeps on getting wider. We wake up in the morning to the stink of chemical spray drift which has been applied during the night on the neighbouring properties. We have not been informed as to what they were spraying and when they will spray it. Of course, this includes fungicides, fertilisers, minerals, herbicides and possibly pesticides. But we wouldn't know, we just have to breathe the spray drift. So this leaves Peter and I sitting at Crossroads, unsure which is the best pathway forward. Do we stay in a farming district which has and probably will continue to be dominated by cereal cropping? We are looking for alternatives and wanting to make choices which actually contribute to a more optimistic future for younger generations of Australians. Recent changes in Australia's carbon market are starting to offer attractive financial returns for carbon sequestration. However, these plantings do not contribute to food production resources for the world's rapidly expanding population. So does the property continue along the land sharing pathway, mixing both food production and landscape health management, or does it engage entirely in sequestering maximum levels of carbon? The region where the farm sits is recognised as a biodiversity hotspot in Australia. The soils are ancient, highly weathered, and have low fertility. It begs the question, should this area ever have been placed into agricultural production? Should it be revegetated and restored and placed into the land-sparing model? I'm going to skip all the rest. I did want to just... Second last slide. I wanted to talk about environmental grief. There it is. If you're like me, I often drive through the landscape and I just get more and more upset. I'm actually really relieved that most of my drive out to the farm is through the Hassel National Park, and I don't actually have to see the continual degradation of our lakes, our riverways, our slopes. I get very, very disheartened, and it goes back again to that lifestyle part of farming. It's just been chucked out the window and it hurts a lot. I don't know if I can keep on living as I keep on driving through a landscape that just keeps on being degraded. The challenges in our landscapes are way beyond the few minds that are trying to find solutions at the moment. We need many, many more clever minds to think tank through the issues and come up with creative new ways forward. We want the next generation to know that we do care about the legacy that we leave behind. We will continue to do our darndest to try and reduce the environmental degradation debt that is sitting out there in the landscape at the moment. And I'd just like to leave you with a few questions. Peter and I actually took these to the National Landcare Conference, and we, rabbited away arguing about these kind of things. But how do we bridge that enormous knowledge gap between urban and rural communities, because it has just got wider and wider? And you can talk to many, many people in Australia now, they have never visited a farm. How do we reduce the ecological blindness in Australia? It's a big one. I drive through the landscape and I see it from the air, I see it across the surface, but I also go underground. That's how I read the landscape. And I think the ability for people to understand the ecological functioning of a landscape has declined. Should government community have regional think tanks to strategically determine which land use will occur in which zone? And there has been many people during this forum that have suggested that we need to bring back those regional strategic planning sessions. Is it time to phase out the concept of landowner and replace these words with land custodian? Now, I know there will be resistance to that, but you can just put it out there and slowly chip away, and maybe it will shift our culture and the way we think. And how do we increase the sharing and caring ethos into our societal thinking instead of that, I'm just going to take everything I can and then I'm going to walk away from a landscape which I've probably degraded. So that was really cheery, wasn't it? But again, I would like to thank everybody who came to the forum, because this is part, I hope, of the future, where we all get together and collaboratively come up with really clever solutions as to how we're going to go forward and turn around that continual land degradation that we are seeing out there. Thank you.
Sylvia, thank you so much for that. I will endeavour to use land custodian rather than land owner in the future. Wellstead is based in a gap of NRM groups, isn't it? Have you noticed an impact of that, bearing in mind that not everybody is so active in terms of revegetating and fencing as you are?
Yeah, no, it's probably been one of the major causes where you talked about the young people having no caring for the land ethos, or that's rapidly declining. That's exactly the same as in Wellstead district. And I was just thinking, we had one of the Landcare officers who was in Wellstead visit just 1 or 2 years ago. Her name was Serena White. And she had been driving around the roads in Wellstead and she goes, "Sylvia, what's that illegal clearing?" And I went, "Oh, you know, it's pretty standard." Well, isn't anybody reporting it? And I thought it was so interesting that she, in the 1990s, you could report illegal clearing. She wouldn't accept it. And I said, "Oh, I don't think there's much you can do. And even if you do report it, nothing will happen." And yeah, that's just a change in how things have gone. So yeah, we haven't had a Landcare officer since 2005. I did try and ask South Coast NRM if we could have one based out in our district, and also wrote to Landcare Australia, and both groups said no. And when I did write funding applications for a while, but when I got knocked back the last time I did it and said, "We feel like you just don't have the capacity to run this program," I said, "Yeah, that's right, because we don't have a Landcare officer." And so I thought, that's it, I'm not applying for funding anymore. And so we are a big black hole, and I think it's really shows in the whole way that the district just, the amount of illegal clearing is pretty phenomenal. Yeah.
Mike? Can we get a microphone to Michael, please? Oh, and then Tim? We'll go you next, Tim.
I just had a question, something that Basil touched on. The NRM world, we get a lot of money from the government. I'm just curious how people think, can we be effective advocates to change government if we're getting government funding? So the analogy I would pose is, in the US, we have a lot of NGOs that are not government funded, like the Nature Conservancy, Audubon Society. They really push government. They sue government, because in the US we like to sue. But they actually get changes on the ground because they don't have the strings attached to the government funding. So, and I would also just note that there's no incentive for the government to change the funding regimes, because every 5 years they get to pat themselves on the back and say, "Look how much we're doing for conservation NRM on the ground." We know those short-term structures don't work for us, but it's really good for the government to roll out and showcase what they're doing. So just a comment there, I'm hoping to get some insight.
Did you want to say anything? Certainly the funding question, resourcing, is critical. Greenskills seems to have survived because we've got a contracting community enterprise, eco-jobs and things like the Tip Shop Reuse Centre, which provide income that we then spread across the whole organisation and can do lots of things. But definitely advocacy is very difficult when your primary source of funding is government. But it doesn't we shouldn't let the government off the hook, though, because they are simply not spending enough. And the other danger is that they're expecting that Landcare or NRM should be primarily volunteer, that it's used to be like the aged sector. It was all done at home by families, and now look what a multi-billion-dollar industry it is. So we have to keep the volunteer sector. Of course, it's vital, but we need to just get much better at advocacy and at all levels, not be scared of developing that. So that's one response.
Thanks, Basil.
Yes, very important thing to move along. I think when people, my experience anyway, is when people get together and start to agree on something and get knowledgeable about what it is they're doing and they get wisdom, there's a sort of a power of lobbying in that process. And I think that's probably related to when we sort of advocacy, it's about taking control of that local environment or the catchment, and then you've got some clout to tell people, the government or funders, what you want to do. And I think that can carry quite a bit of weight, and that's what I mean. We've said to through many of our projects to local groups, NRM groups, you need to know your area really well. I'm talking about the natural values of the area. If you know them very well and everyone's aware of it, and you've got that in a form, say it might be a report or whatever, then that empowers you in some sense. If you just go to people and say, would you give us some money? And people were doing that. Well, just give us some money and we'll work out what we're going to do with it. There's no authority, no foundation of competency, if you like, that will impress distant funders.
All right. Any further questions? Sally? Oh, sorry, Tim. Sorry, Tim.
Oh, no, look, it's a difficult one really because it's not exactly a question, but it is embedded with a bit of a question. Last year, the Western Australian Government put out a state soil health strategy. One of the significant goals in there was about governance and legislation and protection of the landscape. I think the WA Soil Health Strategy aligns very nicely with the National Soil Strategy. They've just announced their soil action plan for the next 5 years. So I really want to encourage people to comment on that. The federal government put out something like about $220 million split into different programs. It could be, potentially funding community groups and the like. Last week I had the National Soil Advocate visiting Western Australia, and one of the things she said was Western Australia is a big state. When you look at the landmass area, it's got a small population and an even smaller kind of like a land care soils community operating in the state. But one of the things that leads Western Australia is the collegiate nature, how people come together and work together to support, some magnificent outcomes. And I think that's probably why Western Australia is a bit different to the eastern states, and why, you're a shining example, Sylvia, of that, collegiality, and why you've, sort of won the National Landcare Award. But I heard it from Phil Wishart yesterday, and I heard it again from you just then. I'm really curious to know why people aren't reporting, illegal land clearing or illegal drainage. Mainly because, yes, we haven't had a Soil and Land Conservation Council in place for a fair period of time. 16 years, I think it is. We've got a council back in place now. But if any member of the community makes a complaint, we're obligated to go out and actually investigate it and look at it. And one of the ones I'm aware of recently, which was a drainage situation, the landholder was forced to fill that drain back in and do restoration works. And I know of 2 sites out Wellstead and Gardner that we've had to investigate recently and deal with. So I just want to say we have people, things go in cycles. They do go in cycles, you know, and we've got new staff that we're training up. We've got some new staff in the Commissioner's office who are now available to, you know, come out and have a look. So I just really want to encourage everybody here. If you see it, report it, because we are obligated to investigate it.
Yeah, I think perhaps we've, as a community, become guilty of getting depressed and yeah, well, it is depressing, and then thinking, oh well, what's the point of doing anything? But you know, there's the old saying that the squeaky wheel gets the attention. So perhaps you're right, Tim, there, that we all need to be more observant, more willing to say something, tread on a few toes perhaps, and that, you know, concerted effort may be just enough to start tipping the scales again.
And Tim, I'm really glad you went out to investigate those complaints. When we got our WA Landcare Award, it was the Soils Commissioner who handed us our beautiful glass trophy, and she said, if you had noticed any illegal clearing, report it to me, because we've got the strongest legislation to actually do something about it. So I followed what she said. I thought, we've got nothing to lose. So I've reported 4 cases of illegal clearing, 2 on either side of us, and 1 in another district and 1 not too far away. The one that most disturbed me was very deliberate and intentional clearing of threatened ecological community, the proteaceous-rich Quangan heathland on the South Coast. And the response I got from DWER was, we've sent the farmer a letter of education. And of course we have that horrible little law, I don't know much about it, that a farmer can clear 10 hectares a year. I thought they used to have to be associated with fire risk, but anyway, so he got his letter of education, but I think he knows he's now being watched by satellite, and he knows his neighbour is one pain in the arse. And I didn't think I had anything to lose. He's an absentee owner. He lives about 40 kilometres away. He was new. He's not going to engage in our community. He's just there to strip and extract. So, yeah, I think being non-government, we have that freedom, and every single member of the public has that freedom. I think if you're working for a catchment group and you're trying to build up trust with your landholders, you do not have that freedom. You break trust very, very quickly.
Yeah.
It is anonymous, though. You can make an anonymous complaint.
Yes.
I know it's tricky in a small community, but the legislation is also going through a process of renewal, and it had some amendments, as John spoke the other day, which is really probably about taking representative bodies off the council and make it a skills-based body, which is a big improvement. But the next set of steps is to actually look at the penalties. And, you know, the penalties are, you know, draconian, ancient, and so that's kind of like the next step that's coming. You can ring up your local DPIRD office and speak to somebody like me in the Albany office, or you can ring up the Deputy Commissioner through DPIRD, or John, or email them.
Hang on a second. There looks like there's going to be some great conversation about this over afternoon tea.
Yeah.
Bill, is your question related or slightly different?
I'm sort of related in that I've reported 2 cases of illegal land clearing, and I've only had feedback from one of them which said the matter had been addressed and I won't be hearing any further notice about it. And in my spies inside the department, they say, well, we sent a letter to say don't do it again. As I pointed out, we can't do it again because we've cleared the whole place on.
Yeah.
To use that land, John.
So let's take that conversation, and I think Kylie and I will work to wrap up some sort of feedback to state government about the topic that has been raised a couple of times. It's afternoon tea time. Before we leave, I'd like you all to join me in thanking our presenters.